Hello, literarians. Welcome back to the Literary Lori YouTube channel. I'm Literary Lori, and if you love to read books or write books that center the lives of Black people and or other people of color globally, then you are in the right place because I love those things too. And I created this YouTube channel to share my love of all the bookish things, bookish and colorful. And also, I created this channel to share my journey going from being a nonfiction writer based in the United States to being a novelist based in the south of Spain. So, if that's what you came here for, I'm so sorry, but that's not what this this video is about. This video is part of my continuing series for Black Literary History Month. Yes, I said Black Literary History Month. Every February, I celebrate Black literary history instead of Black history because there are so many Black writers, incredible Black writers, I have to say, that are born in the month of February. So because I am both Black and bookish, I want to celebrate Black Literary History Month every February because it just should be celebrated because the amount of awesomeness in 1 month, the shortest month might I add, is just, it's too incredible. So that's why I'm doing this, and I'm super happy you're here to learn about all of these incredible literary heroes. All right, so today, speaking of heroes, we are speaking about a true literary hero, and that is none other than Frederick Douglass. Yes, so Frederick Douglass was born on this day, if you're watching in real time, which is February 14th. And this is day 14 of the series. So you might think about Frederick Douglass as a great abolitionist, orator, civil rights hero, which he was all of those things. He was also, in case you didn't know, for a short time, he was also the U.S. ambassador to Haiti. He was a one-time president of the Freedmen's Bank. So Frederick Douglass has been many a things. But for today's video, we are talking specifically about Frederick Douglass, the man of letters. Frederick Douglass, the writer and author. To understand the breadth of his literary work, he was a journalist, he was an essayist, he was a memoirist, and I am going to say it right here, if you haven't heard this before, Frederick Douglass was a literary superstar. Let's talk about it. All right, so we get into Frederick Douglass's story like we've been getting into every other story of the series. So, for the last few episodes, which is through a list of fun facts. And I'm going to keep on doing that because it's working for me. I hope it's working for you. All right. Fun fact number 1 about Frederick Douglass, the literary superstar. All right. Frederick Douglass was actually born with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Yes. And his given birth date is February 18th. February in 1818, pardon me, in Talbot County, Maryland, which was like the eastern shore of Maryland. Now, here's the part that many people don't know. Frederick Douglass never really knew when his actual birth date was. He knew he was born in February, and 1818 might not even be the year. It's either 1818 or 1817, but the official records say 1818. But he chose February 14th as his actual birth date because he remembers his mother calling him her little Valentine sometimes, and he has a memory of her bringing him a chocolate cake that was in the shape of a heart. So he decided to align himself with the day that is, specifically Valentine's Day, and a day associated with love in homage to the memories he has of his mother. But he did die still frustrated that he didn't know his actual birth date, year, or who his father was. So that is our first fact. Number 2 fact about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was actually raised by his grandparents until he was about 5 or 6 years old. He knew who his mother was. Her name was Harriet. Let's remember that. His mother's name was Harriet. And because of the evil system of slavery where they lived, They removed Frederick from his mother, who was sent out to work on a plantation, not even on the same plantation as her children. And the children, including Frederick, were raised by the grandparents because they were basically useless as slaves at that young age. But by the time he was like 5 or 6 years old, it was time for him to be taken up to the big house and start working. And so basically, he's alone as a 5-year-old working on the farm, being a helpmate to the little white boy in the big house, a master's son or some white relative, whatever. Anyway, the point is that Frederick's mother, Harriet, she knew where her son was. She was on a plantation some 12 miles away, but she would still walk at night. She would sneak off of her plantation at the risk of being beaten and walk the 12 miles to come and visit with Frederick and her other children. And Frederick would remember falling asleep with his head on her lap, but waking up and she'd be gone because she had to walk the 12 miles back to the plantation and be there before sunrise, or else, again, get beaten or worse. So sadly, Harriet died very early in Frederick's life. He was still a very young child. He didn't even know she had died for a while because nobody told him. And this was obviously very tragic for him. But later, he found out that his mother could read. Not only could she read, she was the only enslaved person in their whole region and their whole area who could read. And that really touched him. And that's what he credits with his desire and lifelong motivation to read and to write. It was his mother, who was a literate woman. So that was a story that I didn't know about Frederick Douglass. And it made me cry when I read about it, just thinking about the effect that his mother had on him for forever, even though their relationship was cut so tragically short. All right, fact number 3. Obviously, being a slave was horrible. It was torturous. And so Frederick Douglass made the decision to run, and he was successful. At age 20, he escaped Maryland by boat, dressed as a dock worker and carrying the papers of another free man. And he was assisted by his lady friend, Anna Murray. Remember that name. All right, fact number 4. Frederick and his new wife, Anna Murray. So yes, Anna Murray, who helped him escape, they became husband and wife. They changed their name to Douglass to obviously throw off anybody who was searching for a young Frederick Bailey. They eventually settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts. They started a family. Frederick and Anna in total had 5 children together, although one daughter did pass away at the age of 10. But fun fact about his kids, if you remember from a previous episode, like, love how these things, how our literary heroes' stories collide. If you remember, Frederick Douglass's eldest son, Lewis, married the daughter of Reverend Jermaine Wesley Logan, the man whose own autobiography made a white woman see red. That Reverend Logan. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back, look at the list of these episodes, and look for Reverend Jermaine Wesley Logan. Great story. Anyway, back to Frederick. So Frederick Douglass has a family. He's got kids, a wife, and he's doing all kinds of like manual labor jobs to support them. But pretty soon, by his mid-20s, he's been drawn into the abolitionist movement, and that's when he starts his work as a speaker and orator, using his experiences in enslavement to, go on the abolition circuit. And that's what the whole point of these speakers were. It was to share, it was for formerly enslaved individuals to share their experiences, to impress upon people in power in particular, how awful slavery was. He became really well known on the speaker circuit. He also became a minister, and it was in the pulpit that he also perfected his oratory skills. All right. It doesn't hurt that Frederick Douglass is also a very good-looking man. And so you can imagine he's an amazing speaker. He's attractive, tall, he's the whole package, right? So he's really commanding a lot of attention, which leads us to fun fact number 5. Now the facts start getting fun. None of those earlier facts were fun. They were actually kind of sad. But anyway, so we know, most people know that Frederick Douglass's book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, was a big deal. But the reason that Frederick Douglass actually decided to write that book was because he became such a good speaker. People started to doubt that he actually had been enslaved. They were like, he's so articulate, he's so intellectual and smart. He wasn't a slave. It couldn't have been as bad as he said. Sound familiar? Anyway, so he writes The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, his memoir, because he needs to prove the naysayers wrong. He needs to prove that, like he said in all his speeches, he was abused, tortured, broken as an enslaved individual. And, running was his only option. And of course, once he wrote the book, he could put the details, all of the details on paper and distribute that, and people could understand what the horrors of slavery really felt like, looked like, smelled like, tasted like. And his narrative was apparently one of the best of the time, because of course he wasn't the only person writing their experiences in being enslaved. But I guess his narrative was a little more philosophical and forced people to ask, like, why would we do this to another human being? Where is the moral compass of the people who are believing that enslavement is acceptable? So that book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, was published on May 1st, 1845. Fun fact number 6, the memoir sold 5,000 copies within the first 4 months of its publication. That today would be pretty much the grounds to be a bestseller. By 1850, so just 5 years later, over 30,000 copies of the narrative had been published, and it had been translated into French and German. The book went through 9 printings in just the first 3 years of its being published. There was also a UK edition published that was published because Douglass went to England, Ireland, and Scotland to promote the book. And while he was over there, an Irish printer was like, we're going to print our own copies over here because we can't keep them in stock. So this was the point where he becomes an international literary superstar. He was like the literary Beyoncé of the time. He was speaking and then selling his book as like a keepsake or like, a promotional item. People were filling up the places where, I was about to say stadiums. There were no stadiums in the 1840s, but he would be filling up wherever they were having the locations for him to speak. They were literally standing room only. People were standing outside buying his books. And let me tell you, this was not flush times for the people of Ireland, for example, but they still would pony up the money to buy this man's books. That's how much of a literary superstar he was. Fun fact number 7, Frederick Douglass knew a good thing. He was like, so these people are going cray-cray to buy my book about myself. Let me do this again. So yes, over the course of his life, Frederick Douglass wrote not just The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. He wrote 2 more memoirs, so 3 in total. He wrote a second memoir called My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855. And towards the end of his life, he wrote another memoir called Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And that was in 1881. All right. Fun fact number 8. So Frederick Douglass writes his memoir, Narrative of Life. He's like, getting all this praise. People are reading it. He's an international literary superstar. But that's not all he did. It wasn't like he only wrote about himself. In 1847, Frederick Douglass, along with his partner, Martin Delany, launched a newspaper called the North Star. Yes, named after the North Star that the people who were escaping slavery they were told to follow the North Star to make it north. So he started that newspaper. It was an anti-slavery newspaper based in Rochester, New York, but it was distributed all over the world. It was distributed in the U.S., the U.S., the Caribbean, and Europe. So the tagline of the North Star was, quote, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." That was pretty impressive, right? I mean, this man, obviously it's an anti-slavery newspaper, and he said the purpose of the paper was to, quote, promote the moral and intellectual improvement of the colored people. But he was covering European politics. He was covering culture and literature. He was writing about what he wanted to write about that he thought was important for Black people specifically. By the way, just for fun, that publication for that, the cost of the publication for a whole year was $2, but there were over 4,000 subscribers to the North Star. Pretty cool, right? All right. So fun fact number 9, the North Star wasn't the only newspaper that Frederick Douglass headed up. He had 3 different papers that he was either the editor or publisher for. So you had the North Star, which ran from 1847 to 1851. That eventually folded and became the Frederick Douglass paper. Don't be humble, Frederick. That ran for almost 10 years, from 1851 to 1860. Then he wrote another paper that was based in the DC, when he was based in DC, called the New National Era. Okay. Sadly, sad epilogue there. While Frederick Douglass and his family they had moved down to Washington, D.C., but they still had their Rochester home, which I think they used like a summer home or a weekend home. But there was a fire there and everything was destroyed. So there were full episodes. There were full copies of the North Star, the Frederick Douglass paper, and the Douglass Monthly, which was another like insert magazine that he created. So they were all destroyed in the fire. So apparently there's no complete collection of any of these newspapers. So if you ever find one of any of them, make sure you hold on to it, because again, all of the full collections were destroyed in that fire, which is tragic. All right, fun fact number 10. I bet you didn't know this unless you listen to my podcast, but Frederick Douglass wrote a novel. So yes, the man, memoir, nonfiction, journalism, essays, his speeches, but the man also wrote a novel, which makes me think that, again, this man was so dedicated to the literary arts. He wrote a novel called The Heroic Slave, and it was based on the largest slave rebellion in the United States called the Creole Case, which I had never heard of. So if you haven't either, look it up. The novel was published in 1852, so it was after his first memoir, but before the second one. In between, he wrote himself a little novel. Today, I think we might have called it a novella, but still, it was fiction. So Frederick Douglass was like doing all the things. And you think, like, if only this man hadn't had to spend most of his life fighting racism, right? Like what he would have produced, what he would have given the world in terms of literature. Just to think about it. All right. Fun fact number 11. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century, more than even Abraham Lincoln. So maybe you know this, maybe you don't, maybe you've heard it, but it was not an accident, right? Frederick Douglass really understood, like Martin Luther King Jr., how to use the media for his benefit. And it wasn't like, oh, I want to sell more books, let me get more pictures taken, although that probably helped. But it was more because he wanted to change the image of the Black man in America. He wanted to be photographed wearing a suit, looking distinguished. He wanted to change the image of Black man from slave to sophisticated. And so he was like, take my picture. See how attractive I am. Look at me in my finest, right? So that was very clear and cultivated and helped him, or I shouldn't say helped him, was part of his overall assignment to change the plight of Black people in the United States. Fun fact number 12. As a best-selling author who knew how to sell books and newspapers and speak, Douglass was able to afford a good lifestyle for himself and his family and his extended family. In 1877, he bought an estate called Cedar Hill in the Washington, D.C. area, southeast D.C. It was a 21-room house on a 15-acre estate. And he lived there, and he even had a writing shed, if you will, on the property, which is lovely. And he lived there in Cedar Hill until his death at age 77 in 1895. He went to some political event came home and he had a heart attack and died, but he died in his home and he was 77 years old, which might not seem really old, but when you think of all of the other speakers we've talked about, all the other writers who died early, in their 60s of terrible diseases, Frederick Douglass lived a good long time and he lived many lives. All right, now fun fact number 13, I met one of Frederick Douglass's descendants in the craziest of places, but it makes sense for this series, in Spain. Yes, when I did my junior year of college abroad, one of the people on my program was one of Frederick Douglass's descendants. I have always been a huge Frederick Douglass fan, like always. I was obsessed with the idea of being a writer and a speaker and like a champion of civil rights. And I was like, Frederick Douglass was the model. So meeting his descendant, I acted like a plum fool. I acted like I had met Beyoncé on my study abroad program and would just like follow him around and stalking him. Anyway, it was exciting in my mind. But yeah, that's my last fun fact about Frederick Douglass. All right, so I want to leave you, I hope you found that fascinating. I want to leave you with two thoughts. One, I want to put a pin in this idea of the fact that Frederick Douglass really was a literary superstar. I mean, he was a superstar in many arenas. This is not to say that this is not to supersede all of his other important contributions or how people saw him, but he really was a literary superstar. I wanted to read this one quote that was written about him during his UK tour after his book came out. This is what a man named Isaac Nelson. He was a Presbyterian minister, so he had clout. This is what he wrote about Douglass's work. He said, quote, "Frederick Douglass is a literary wonder, such an intellectual phenomenon as only appears at times in the Republic of Letters," unquote. He said literary wonder. Okay. Does this white man have to say this about Frederick Douglass? Literary wonder? No. So that's just one that I plucked out, okay? There was like the 19th century Goodreads. There's lots of, comments that people were making at the time that spoke about not just like, oh, he's so good about the civil rights or like the abolitionist. No, literary wonder, intellectual phenomenon, that's nothing to do with civil rights. That's nothing to do with abolition. That is the quality of the writing. Which brings me to my last quote. Robert Levine wrote a comprehensive biography about Frederick Douglass. And this is what he said, which I think is the way we're going to end this session. He said, quote, "For Douglass, writing was action. As he saw early on in his career when his narrative galvanized abolitionists. This orator and activist believed that writing could change the world." If I wasn't afraid of ruining my video, I would throw my mic right now, okay? Because that is the message right there, is writing is action and writing can change the world. It really can. That's the lesson. I hope you take it. I hope it inspires you. Think about the fact that Frederick Douglass was writing through enslavement, was writing through Civil War, was writing through fake, Reconstruction and then the demise of that. Like, if he's not proof of the power of writing and what we can do and what we must do, I don't know what is. So I hope that inspires some of you watching today who are writers to pick up the pen. All right. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for coming and making your comments. I really appreciate them. I will see you tomorrow for another video about another amazing Black writer born in February. Bye.